Number 10. The test that survived millennia. Creating new life in ancient Egypt was especially sacred. Ancient Egyptians blended religion and science almost to perfection. Women were taking pregnancy tests in ancient Egypt 3,500 years ago, but they did it a little bit differently than modern women do today. There are some medical texts in the papyrus Carlsberg collection at the University of Copenhagen that give shocking details as to how a woman could figure out whether she was carrying a child or not. The text, written around 1400 BC, says a woman would urinate on 2 different bags. One bag was filled with barley, while the other bag was filled with wheat. If either bag began sprouting after it was peed on, that meant the woman was pregnant and could plan for her future. But if the bags didn't sprout, it meant she wasn't pregnant. The Egyptians even had a weird way of telling what sex the child was going to be. Let's say the bag of barley sprouted faster than the bag of wheat. It meant the baby would be a boy. But if the wheat sprouted first, the baby would be a girl. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, actually, according to a study that was conducted in 1963, the ancient Egyptian method was 70% accurate. It wasn't accurate at all when it came to determining the sex of the child, but the method of urinating on a bag of barley and a bag of wheat does work 7 out of 10 times. It was effective because the elevated levels of estrogen work to promote seed growth. Ta-da! Number 9. Bizarre hangover cure. Ancient Egyptians had to deal with a lot of the same problems as people today. For example, they also had to nurse gnarly hangovers after drinking too much beer. Scientists recently came across a papyrus that was written 1,900 years ago, and it details an unusual hangover cure. The document was found amidst 500,000 texts discovered from a dump at the edge of an ancient Egyptian town in 1898. The hangover cure called for a garland of leaves from the Alexandrian laurel, a large evergreen plant. Scientists say the plant has no medical properties whatsoever, but the Egyptians certainly thought it did. They believed the leaves could relieve a headache. In the ancient text, which was written in Greek, the recipe was described as a remedy for a drunken headache. The papyrus is more than just a cure for a bad hangover, though. It gives us some insight into the behavior of ancient Egyptians. Clearly, drinking too much alcohol was a common problem. Ancient Egyptians loved to drink during religious festivals, and there were a lot of them. It was also an issue in other ancient cultures as well. In Mesopotamia, men were advised to take licorice, beans, oleander, and oil after a night of drinking to help recover. And in ancient Rome, the recipe called for a feast of roasted onions and African snails. What's your favorite hangover cure? Let me know in the comments. Number 8. Cats in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians had a truly bizarre obsession with cats. Cats were the most popular pets in Egypt. Even the word cat comes from the Egyptian word for cat, quata. Greeks derived gata from the Egyptian derivative of the word, and from that came the Spanish gato and the German Katze. Even the word pussycat comes from the Egyptian cat goddess Bastet or Pasht. Every piece of evidence shows that Egyptians had a long and healthy relationship with their feline friends. The first feline goddess came into existence around 3150 BC. Her name was Mafdet, and she was worshipped as the embodiment of justice. She was also one of the deities who protected Ra, the god of the sun, as he went on his nightly journey through the underworld before rising in the morning. Centuries later came Bastet, the goddess of fertility and domesticity. She had her center of cultic worship in the town of Bubastis, which grew to be one of the richest places in the country. According to ancient historian Herodotus, people traveled from all over Egypt to bury their dead cats in Bubastis. They believed it was the closest their deceased felines could get to the goddess. By far, the strangest part of the Egyptian cat obsession is what they did when their cat died. Sure, they traveled a great distance to bury the cat in Bubastis, but they also shaved off their eyebrows in mourning. Imagine someone who lived in Bubastis, every day seeing men and women with their eyebrows shaved off, looking for a place to bury their deceased feline. It's important to note that when it comes to body hair, even though cats were important, dogs were even more important. When a dog died, their owner would shave their entire body. Number 7. Head cones. If you look closely at paintings made in ancient Egypt about 3,300 years ago, you'll notice something strange. There are weird, cone-shaped objects sitting on top many of their heads, like upside-down coffee mugs. Archaeologists have been baffled by the objects for decades, and rightfully so. What were these weird hats, and did people really wear them? Or were they only depicted in paintings? Well, scientists finally found an answer to some of their questions. They found evidence that the head cones were real, and researchers think people were wearing them as far back as the 14th century BC. In the city of Akhetaten, researchers found a pair of head cones buried in some graves in a cemetery reserved for workers. The bodies were so amazingly preserved that their head cones were tangled with their remaining hair. Each cone was the color of cream and only measured just a few inches tall. All of them were made out of beeswax. But still, what in the world were people wearing these for? Unfortunately, that part of the mystery has yet to be fully solved. The best guess archaeologists have is that they were placed on the head and allowed to slowly melt in the sun. They were probably full of essential oils and smelled really good. Imagine placing a clump of beeswax on your head and walking around in the heat until it melted all over your body. That's what Egyptians in Akhetaten may have been doing. Researchers think it might have been a purification ritual, meant to literally and physically cleanse a person, but it's still not clear. Number 6. Reptilian Contraceptives. Contraceptives have been around for most of civilization, and in Egyptian records from about 1550 BC, there is mention of an extremely unusual method to avoid pregnancy. Even by current standards, it's disturbing and downright horrifying. The ancient texts say that to prevent pregnancy, a woman could use acacia leaves smothered in honey as an active contraceptive. But that's only one suggestion, and definitely not the worst. Another method was to use pulverized crocodile dung. Egyptian physicians believed that by using crocodile feces as a contraceptive, pregnancy could be prevented for up to 3 years. The text doesn't go into any gruesome specifics as to how things might proceed between the man and the woman once the crocodile dung was applied, but you can likely imagine it wasn't particularly pleasant. The Romans were equally as obsessed with methods of birth control, but they used a whole ton of different materials to prevent pregnancy. Instead of using crocodile dung, they created contraceptives from goat bladders, animal intestines, fish, and ordinary lengths of linen. Number 5. Makeup for men. In the days before YouTube makeup tutorials, ancient Egyptians copied the styles of the nobility when it came to cosmetics. 4,000 years ago, wealthy Egyptian women exfoliated their skin and even had their own face masks for hydration. They waxed their hair with a honey and sugar mixture. They even used eyeshadow, lipstick, and heavy black eye makeup, which is famously known as kohl. But kohl could be used for 2 things. It was applied for appearance-boosting purposes, but also for protecting their eyes from the glare of the desert sun. And it wasn't only women who used these fancy cosmetic products. Men were also all about makeup and looking good. The thing about Egyptians was that they were extremely spiritual. Everything was a ritual, and everything was important in its own way. Things they did were also symbolic a lot of the time, especially when it came to animals. People would add animal pigments to their makeup, believing that they were being imbued with some of that animal's power. And this was something men just couldn't resist. Makeup was also seen as a protective force against the influences of evil. Men and women alike covered their faces in dark makeup to protect themselves and to stay fashionable. All these products needed their own containers, so it wouldn't have been unusual to find jars and pots in a man's bedroom filled with cosmetics. Back in the days of the ancient Egyptians, wealthy men would have had their very own makeup nooks. Number 4. The mummification process. Egyptians weren't the only people in the world to create mummies. People were doing it in the Andes Mountains of Peru thousands of years before. But the Egyptians developed an unhealthy obsession with preserving their dead. And it started around 2,600 years ago, continuing up until the Roman period of 30 BC. It took 70 days to make a mummy. Special priests worked alongside embalmers to treat and wrap the body. First and foremost, all the internal parts were removed before they could decay. The brain was then pulled out using a hook shoved in through the nostrils. Organs were removed from the chest through an incision on the left side of the abdomen. And the only thing that was left in place was the heart, because Egyptians believed it was where a person's soul resided. The rest of the organs were placed in canopic jars. But in some cases, organs would be treated, wrapped in their own bandages, and then placed back inside the body. Next came the removal of the moisture from the body of the deceased individual. The body was covered in a kind of salt that allowed it to quickly dry out. Then the hollow body was stuffed full of linen. Fake eyes were attached to give the illusion of life. And after that came the wrapping, which could involve almost a mile of linen cloth if needed. It was such a lengthy process that it took the embalmers and the priests up to 2 weeks to complete. 2 full weeks of endlessly wrapping the corpse. And of course, applying various layers of resin to assist with the preservation of the mummy. Amulets would often be placed among the wrappings as well. Strips of linen would be covered in spells and magical words. It was an extremely detailed process. But why did the Egyptians have such an obsession with death? Historians think it was the opposite. They had an obsession with life. Egyptians loved being alive so much that they wanted to ensure that after they died, they continued to thrive in the afterlife. Number 3. Egyptian cocaine. In 1992, an Egyptian priestess was discovered covered in cocaine. Her name was Henut Tawi, and she lived during the 21st dynasty 3,000 years ago. Nothing is known about her life other than that she worked as a priestess at the Temple of Amun in Thebes. When she died, her body was embalmed and placed within the Deir el-Bahari necropolis. After the discovery of her mummy, it was given to King Ludwig I of Bavaria. Now it's on display in Germany. German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova was responsible for discovering trace amounts of cocaine in the mummy's hair in 1992. Not just cocaine, but also hashish and nicotine. This priestess was doing coke, smoking dope, and was likely chewing tobacco leaves. This was a major discovery because up until 1992, scientists assumed there was no cocaine or nicotine in Africa until after Christopher Columbus went to the Americas. If cocaine and nicotine existed in ancient Egypt, it means there may have been contact with the pre-Columbian people of the Americas. And if that's proven, it will change every single history book in the world. The discovery is still extremely controversial to this day. Scientists have argued the tests were contaminated. And even though other mummies have been found with trace amounts of cocaine, the results are often unrepeatable. Nobody knows if Egyptian priests and priestesses were really hopped up on drugs or not. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Number 2. King Tutankhamun's sandals. King Tutankhamun walked around on his enemies. The king's tomb was discovered in the 1920s, filled to the brim with treasure. There was so much treasure, in fact, that it was only in 2007 that researchers started studying the 80 samples of footwear found buried with the young ruler. Apparently, those were all the shoes he needed to go with him into the afterlife. Some were found in good condition, while others were decayed beyond repair. But the most exciting pair of all was the king's gold sandals, which were placed on the feet of King Tut's mummy. Many of the sandals found within the tomb have an unusual depiction on their bottom. The inner soles of the sandals show prisoners bound and suffering. Some of the shoes have African prisoners, likely from the kingdom of Nubia. Others, however, show prisoners with more Asiatic features, likely meant to represent the people of the East. While King Tut wore these sandals, he would have quite literally been stepping on his enemies as he went about his daily routine. Researchers don't know if King Tut wore the sandals or if they were merely symbolic. They also aren't sure if the king had them made specifically so he could step on the faces of his enemies. Maybe King Tut wanted to defeat his enemies so badly that he walked around on their faces. The other thing that feels a little extreme is that the king owned 80 pairs of sandals. But what in the world was he supposed to do with them in the afterlife? Maybe humans have just always had an obsession with footwear. After all, it's not much different from famous and rich people today. Number 1. Egyptian marriage. Marriage in ancient Egypt was weird in comparison to marriage today. The biggest difference is that there was no marriage ceremony. You didn't get together with friends and family and throw a party. There was no ritual binding a man and a woman in holy matrimony. Instead, the marriage was official and complete when the woman entered the man's house with the agreed-upon goods. For example, a donkey and a bag of food. Marriage in ancient Egypt was typically arranged by the parents, who agreed on the price the groom's family should pay for his right to marry the bride. Prenuptial agreements were also common, and if the bride entered the marriage with extremely valuable objects, it was expected that she would keep these objects if the marriage was terminated. Egyptologist Barbara Watterson wrote that marriage in Egypt was all about setting up a house. There were a lot of standard rules as well. All the children of the marriage belonged solely to the mother. If she were to leave during a divorce, all her children would go with her. Historian Don Nardo wrote that for the time, women were given a fantastic amount of freedom in marriage. In most ancient societies, women were treated as property, but in Egypt, women were seen more as equals. Yes, it was still a male-dominated world, and women were expected to abide by men's rules, but compared to everywhere else, Egypt was a great place to be married. In that regard, marriages in ancient Egypt weren't that strange. The weirdest part was perhaps the lack of a ceremony. Beyond that, marriage was only a creepy thing if you were part of the royal family. Royals were typically expected to marry their brother or their sister. Inbreeding was hugely popular with royalty and nobility, but for everyone else, it was strongly discouraged. Thanks for watching! What do you think is the weirdest thing done in ancient Egypt? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up for more, and I'll see you next time. Bye!